I'd like to call the meeting to order. And we basically have two items on the agenda, talking about both new construction funding and modernization funding.
Yes, we'll have Tracy Sharp introduce the new construction item.
Yeah. Good morning. As you know, we've touched on new construction briefly when we first started the meetings and did some detailed review early on of eligibility for new construction. And as stated, today we're going to go over the funding aspect. So basically, the new construction program provides funding for classrooms based to house unhoused students based on either a 5 or 10-year projection. And districts get a base grant based on a pupil grant amount plus supplemental grants. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail on that, how that calculation works and the various grants they can access. So the basic formula for eligibility is the 5 or 10-year projection minus the existing capacity, and then the which gives the district their basic eligibility amount that they can draw from to build new classrooms. So there's 4 basic types of construction grant requests that they can submit. The first two they're listed at the bottom of page 1. And for those districts that have qualified for the financial hardship program, meaning they don't have sufficient funds for their full 50-50 match, can access funding through a design grant where they get some funding up front to basically hire a design professional and draw up plans, get those approved through the division of the state architect, and begin the process of getting the state agency approvals that we discussed at our last meeting. They can also access funding to purchase a site. And basically, in order to do that, what they need is a preliminary plan approval from Department of Education for their site and an appraisal of that site. And then they can request funding to acquire that site. There's also an option for districts where it's called an environmental hardship separate site grant. And this would be applicable in a case where a site requires cleanup and the Department of Toxic Substance Control has determined that that's going to take more than 6 months to complete the cleanup. So they can access funding ahead of their full grant in order to get started on that site.
Okay.
And yes?
I'm sorry, since we only have 2 items, I'm going to interrupt you right now. We talked about this last time. If someone gets state funding, they have to go through DTSC for clearance. Mm-hmm. But if they're using their own dollars, they don't have to. They just have to get assurances from locals that the site is clean. Do you ever see a scenario where someone builds their own school, then later comes back to us for hardship dollars to move or something like that because of the environmental situation? I'm just wondering, do we put the DTSC in the loop on every site or not? That's my question.
No, I mean, even if a school district moves forward with their own funding and then decides to come in for state funding, they still have to come in and meet all the requirements. Other than that, we don't get involved, or we don't know of school sites that districts pursue with local funding. But if they do decide to come in for the program, then all the requirements kick in.
So no other supplement grants later?
If they qualify. They can come in and request funding, and if they meet the criteria, then they can.
Okay, we'll keep going then. So those are 3 types of funding that a district could get early on in the project to help them move forward. And then finally, there's what we call the new construction adjusted grant, and that's the full funding for the project with the pupil-based grant, the number of pupil grants they've requested, plus the applicable supplemental grants for the project. And on page 2, we have a chart that, at the bottom of page 2, that basically shows the required documents when submitting these various types of applications for funding. And these are the basic minimum requirements for what a district is going to submit with their application. There's other documentation that will be necessary depending on which supplemental grants they qualify for and are requesting. And that's basically the funding application, the GSA-approved plans and specifications, the approvals from the Department of Education, if they're requesting high performance, and if they're requesting site development, they'll submit a detailed spreadsheet of those requests as well. And then for site acquisition, the main requirement is either an escrow closing statement or court order, and a court order is required in cases where there are condemnation proceedings. And we'll see the cost of the site listed in there. So we have a detailed description of each of those documents. They're on the next couple of pages. And then I'll move on to page 4, the application review process. Basically, when a district submits their funding application, and which is commonly called the SAB 5004, they're processed on a first-in, first-out basis, basically on a date order received. We receive the application, ensure that it contains all the basic required documents to start the funding process review, and then we continue on with a detailed review of that application. And our review, it basically takes it's a three-prong review that happens concurrently. We're looking closely at the funding application itself, at all the elements requested on there. We will do a review of what we would typically call the site acquisition package. All the elements of that site, does it meet all the CDE requirements and the Department of Toxic Substance Control, and look at those documents and determine how much their supplemental grants are going to be based on the documentation submitted. When we review the project, it goes and we look at it and see if there's anything that is either missing or might need a change. We have what we call our 15 and 4-day letter review process. And what that means is we are taking a full assessment of that application, determining if there are any elements that are missing or need to be corrected, and send the district a letter that gives them 15 days to respond with corrections and to work with us to correct those elements of it. And then typically, a district is requesting pupil grants to build classrooms and add additional capacity, whether it's a brand new site or whether it's additions to an existing site. But there's two other ways a district can use their pupil grant eligibility listed there on page 5, and we call those a use of grants. And in the first example, a district is asking for pupil grants that exceed the classrooms they're building. And what they can do with those is they can use their pupil grants to build another type of facility. That would be either a multi-purpose room, a library, or a gym, or it could be a hybrid of a multi-purpose room and a gym. For example, say the district on an elementary site does not have a library. They need to build a library on that site. So they can, and that's one of the qualifiers for it in the regulations, that either they don't have that type of facility existing on site, excuse me, or the one that they have is considered inadequate. So they can access their pupil grants, and if they meet all the criteria in the reg, use pupil grants to build that facility. Question?
Just clarification. Mm-hmm. So these are site-specific pupil grants, or district-wide pupil grants? And I think that's something I know what the answer is before I ask it. But what I'm saying is, if we have a projection to grow a neighborhood out, a 30,000 population, you need a new high school, need junior high, and it's way off. Mm-hmm. So the current pressure right now may be to build a new multi-purpose room existing or replace some facilities. So they use those pupil grants, even though they have them on paper, but they use it for a different facility. What happens when they need them when that neighborhood does get built out?
Well, in the requirements for utilizing that regulation for a use of grants, the district is required to have their local board approve that use of grants, and with that approval comes a plan as well for if we're going to use, as our example here is 25 K-6 pupil grants on this elementary site to add a library, how are we going to house those 25 pupils in the future? And so that is incumbent on the district and their local board to approve that plan.
But you can spread grants across the district, so you could so you could potentially end up with a situation where you're using grants that are, the only reason the eligibility is there is because you have future development that's intended to go in that district, and you could potentially use those grants for other purposes, in which case, when it comes time to build the school there, you're short.
Yeah, that's correct, Madam Chair. The use of grants is contingent upon the district having eligibility, and the eligibility is either on a district-wide basis or on a high school attendance area basis.
Right.
In a high school attendance area, if there is development within that high school attendance area, then yes, it has to be built there. But on a district-wide basis, the districts can use it anywhere on any campus as they see fit.
I don't recollect, however, at any time that we as a board have had to deal with someone that had a use of grants and then they were coming back saying, I made a mistake, I don't have enough for my project over here. Do you recollect any of that? I mean, I think it's operated. The flexibility of it has operated without people having to come back to us saying they've made a mistake.
What I would suggest is that it's not a matter of coming back to the board per se. I guess you could come back for financial hardship, but the problem is that you create at the district level. I mean, I will tell you that I have personal experience with our district where they had a pilot enrollment project that was approved back in the 1980s, and it was based on future enrollment and enrollment projections. So we got grants and we spent them, and the enrollment projections never really came to fruition. So then when we needed to expand capacity at schools, we had to have it 100% district financed because we weren't eligible for state financing. So the reality is if you don't, I mean, I believe the grant should if we're going to allow a cohort where you can have eligibility beyond your current enrollment because you want to be sure schools are built when the houses are built and the students arrive, then it's coming in later in the parking lot item. But I would suggest that it might be prudent to make sure that eligibility stays with the development, because that's the only reason you have it.
I'll look forward to that discussion, but having come from a high-growth district in my other life, to have tracked the growth by each school that we built would have been really tough over time, and the flexibility to use your growth funding how you needed to use it to meet your needs across the district was really important.
But I would suggest, though, that you have two elements of growth. One is infill growth within your existing area, and then and growth for a whole new development that's coming into it, I would suggest, which should be treated differently, but we can have that discussion a little bit later.
So is the flexibility, is that encouraged by statute or encouraged by policy of the board?
It's in statute that it's district-wide. The enrollment, the projection is district-wide. The gross classroom inventory is district-wide. And once a district establishes eligibility, then the district can use it on any site. So it's on a district-wide basis, and once the district has it, they can use it on any school site.
You can continue. Go ahead.
So there's one other type of use of grants that adds flexibility to the district's use of their pupil grant eligibility, and that is to request grants for a different grade level. For example, a district needs to build some 9-12 classrooms, but they don't currently have any eligibility or sufficient eligibility to build the number of classrooms that they have. They do have eligibility in K-6. They could borrow from the K-6 grade level to add to their 9-12 classrooms. And again, that is with approval of their local board. and to have a plan as well in place for how they're going to address the use of that eligibility. So from there, I'd like to jump to the actual funding application. It starts on page 15. There are a number of pages of instructions, but the actual form itself, where districts are completing it, is on page 20. As I said earlier, this is the application for funding, and this is what a district is submitting to the Office of Public School Construction that triggers their request for using their eligibility and actually accessing the funding that will come later. You'll see the basic information. We've highlighted the relevant sections here, and this form completion matches with the sample grant calculation that we've included as well, in order to demonstrate basically what is the district submitting to us to access the funding. They're giving us their district particulars. They're telling us what type of application it is. In this case, it's a new construction application. And it's for an elementary school, and they're requesting 500 pupil grants at the K-6 level for this particular project. There's a number of other questions here as we move along that they're telling us about the project. If it is a use of grants, they'll tell us that. And then where is this going to be located? In this case, it's a new site. So the district is building a new K-6 school. We move on down to item number 3, and we're getting information about the number of classrooms in the project, as well as information about the site. And this site information, the usable acres, the master plan, existing and proposed, should match up with the information that we get from the Department of Education plan approval and site approval letters. And moving on to page 21, this is where we'll go through some of the supplemental grants. As I mentioned earlier, the district has their pupil grant eligibility that they're drawing on, in this case 500 pupil grants. That's what makes up the base grant. Then depending on their site itself and where they're located, they could qualify for a number of supplemental grants. In this case, the first option there is for therapy area. If there were special day classes in the severe category and there was therapy area, they're going to get additional grants for a certain amount of square footage there. In this case, there isn't one. It's 25 basic K-6 classrooms. But for multi-level construction, if their site meets the requirements, they could get a 12% increase for the classrooms. In this case, it's 20 classrooms are multi-story, so they're going to get a 12% increase for that. They're a small district, less than 2,500 pupils, so they would qualify potentially, or would qualify for the project assistance grant to help them out. That's a standard amount that's approved each year and increased based on the annual CCI, or I should say adjusted based on the annual CCI. And then there are site acquisition grants. So in this case, a district will get the lesser of either 50% of the actual cost of the site or 50% of the appraised value of the site. In this case, the actual cost is $5 million, so they're getting a grant for $2.5 million. In addition to that, they can get grants for half of the relocation costs. They get a 2% increase on that $2.5 million for the cost of appraisals, escrow, and other site testing. And then they can get reimbursed for the cost of the DTSC oversight fees when there is hazardous waste removal. And in this case, our example includes grants for the removal of hazardous waste on this site. So that encompasses the site, what we would call typically the site acquisition grant, are all those items. Then in addition to that, they have their site development grants. What's it going to cost to prep this site and build on it in 3 categories there for service site, off-site, and utilities. And then there's a grant called General Site that is calculated based on the site size and grade level of the project. That's intended to build the hardscape areas of the site. Moving on down, we see there's additional grants for automatic fire detection and alarm, automatic sprinkler systems, and those are a standard grant amount that is applied based on the number of pupil grants requested. And in the case where they've chosen to pursue the high performance incentive grants, this case, this district acquired 34 points, so there's a percentage increase to the project based on the number of points that they've earned. And then we have a category number 7, excessive cost hardship grants, depending on the location in the state. If it's a remote area or has other issues, there could be a geographic increase, anywhere from 5 to 20%. And in one special case, it's higher than that. And if it were a small-size project, it could get an increase, and that's for projects that request 101 or less, or between, 100 or less, or between 101 and 200. They could get an increase. In this case, it's larger than that, so they didn't qualify for the small-size project. And finally listed there is the urban security impacted site grant. This is a percentage increase based on the size of the site. For sites that are in very small spaces or small site size and may have restrictions on the actual construction there, they might need to access surrounding areas to get in and build on there. And that is, as I said, based on the size of the site. They meet the qualifications. So in addition to that, we're collecting some additional information here on the form in items 9 through 13. If they have gotten previous apportionments, was there a previous design or site on the project? Are they reporting additional classrooms that they built in a locally funded project? We would capture that. And then finally, if we turn to the next page, page 22, we are asking the district for construction contract dates and notice to proceed dates. That helps us to determine, is this going to be under a labor compliance program, depending on when the construction contract was signed, or is it going to be subject to the Department of Industrial Relations prevailing wage monitoring requirements. And then we ask about their construction delivery method, whether or not this would be included, if there's any classrooms in here that would be part of a career tech project. And then there's some certifications that we request specifically from the architect of record. And they are signing the form and certifying that it meets, that the plans and specs are DSA approved, and anything that wasn't reviewed by DSA meets Title 24 requirements. There's a second certification by the architect that basically says that they certify that the cost of construction is at least 60% of the grant, the hard construction costs. Then following that, we have the district certifications under item number 23 that start on page 22, continue on page 23, and finish on page 24. All of these are not 100% applicable to new construction. Some apply to modernization. These are the self-certifications that the districts sign on to when they sign the project. So with this 5004, in attachment C, we've provided on page 25 the calculation for this project. What, in 2013, if we were to process this project today, what grants, based on what the information they've provided, have they qualified for, as well as how to calculate those grants. And we had a similar example in our earlier new construction presentation, and this follows it. The ones that are more complicated have more steps to them. The general site, high performance, and urban security grant are listed on the next page. So as I mentioned earlier, this is part of our 15 and 4-day letter review process that we go through to review the application and advise the district of any inconsistencies. That's what's going on during that 90 to 120 days of processing the application, completing it, verifying those state agency reviews and approvals, verifying the grants that they're eligible for. At times, districts miss grants that they are eligible for, and we will advise them that there are additional supplemental grants that they've qualified for through that process. So we've talked about the supplemental grants that districts can qualify for. I'd like to take a step back to page 7, where we have some new construction fast facts on the program. And basically what we've done is taken a look at every new construction project that's been funded since the beginning of the program. And so this would include funded and unfunded approvals, and broken those out and said, okay, how much has the board funded? Well, it's been $14.5 billion just in the new construction program. And these charts show a comparison of that broken out into how much was the base grant, site acquisition, and then the various other supplemental grants provided in the program. And you'll see the amounts there, new construction including the site acquisition in the first green chart, and then the second one, if we just take out the site acquisition and compare the base grant to the supplemental grants, we see the 76-24 split.
Sorry. This is our dollars spent on these projects.
These are the grants, yes.
This is the grant amounts. So it's not what the district has included as well.
Correct.
I know we're kind of trying to figure out those numbers, but do you have any kind of representation if we're truly hitting 50% on average? Are we hitting 40%? Are we hitting 60% of the actual cost? Does anyone even know?
That's a sort of, this is what we provided at the funding stage. The other information I think is something that you're asking about is the type of information that we capture in the project information worksheet, because it's actual cost. This is funding, so in the project information worksheet, we do have the total project cost for the project. We start taking a look at what was funded versus what was actually spent. We don't have those figures for you today, but that's the sort of information that's available.
Any way to, I know you can't go back and check every project, nor do I want to, but as we're going forward, I'm trying to see that if, I mean, the whole reason we're having these subcommittees is to figure out if we need to make any changes for the next bond program, if there's going to be another bond program. So I'm of the notion that we'd like to do that more informed than less informed. Is there any way to go back and work with maybe some sample projects? I was looking at the formulas they're using on attachment C. You know, a fire detection system, automatic sprinkler system, I'm pretty much sure that's going to be code, at least the fire sprinkler system. You know, to figure out per person, when you can put 15 students or 30 students in a classroom versus what it actually costs to build on a facility makes more sense to me, you know. Those type of issues. I'm just wondering if we have any data, and I know there's certain things, and maybe even compare it to possibly, you know, other best practices and maybe other states that may be helpful as we go forward, just to say, okay, are we spending too much on one, not enough on the other? Is there better ways to get accurate accounts? It seems like you get almost, I wouldn't call it double dip, but if you were in an urban setting, you get paid extra. If you're in a rural setting, you get paid extra. Who's the guy who's not getting paid anymore? I mean, there's always a supplemental for one setting or the other. Because they both can argue there's more cost to it. You have to drive materials out further, labor's further. It's also probably cheaper labor. So there's all these different factors in the real world. I'm just trying to figure out how's it compared to when you actually cost it out. Thank you.
The information we have, again, it's going to be very limited to what the district's reported. So, I mean, you can potentially see and compare what cost that was reported, but again, it's very much driven by self-reported information.
It's self-reported, but since they're a public entity, regardless if they spend their own bond dollars, their own operational costs, or our dollars, all that stuff should be accessible to the general public, much less us, because they have to get a board approval when they sign those bills, right? So it should be agendized as some board item, and it should be approved, you know, somewhat. And those bills have to be submitted. I'm not saying go investigate everything. I'm just saying samples may be helpful when we come up with new formulas. Thank you.
I would offer that through the report that we did with the UC Berkeley, or had done through UC Berkeley at the macro level. it was about a 70-30 split that they determined, and it was based upon what was expended by the state, the $35 billion over time, and what was expended by the locals in terms of their accounting for their bond measures. Not an exact science by any mean. It was very macro.
Yeah, and the problem is, I know, like my local school district went out and did bonds, but they didn't get any SAB dollars. So they spent a bunch of bond money on buildings and built a lot of projects, which is great. A lot of the extra goodies that we wanted as a community, pools and things like that, none of that was leveraged against any state dollars, so that number can be completely off depending on if they actually combine projects with this or not. So we need to actually look at the projects we funded, some samples, and see what that ratio looks like.
And I would say my anecdotal experience is usually with modernization, it falls short depending on how far you want to go with the modernization. But I do think there are significant local dollars that are spent on adding the multi-use rooms that were never built, building the theaters that were never built, in addition to others. So I do think it's hard to say that the state's only contributing a third of the cost.
No, I said it was macro.
Yeah.
Probably it would be really, I'm sorry, it would be very valuable to see individual projects, how it transpired.
Madam Chair, just to follow up, I don't know when we're going to get to the changes, but it'd be nice to have some of these things kind of worked on before we get to the change part,
Well,
where are recommendations, I don't know.
I think we probably could segue, if we wanted to, into page 8, which is the new construction parking lot items. These are items that we've tried to consolidate that have come up as we've discussed new construction over the last few months. We can shrink the list or grow the list or whatever, but I thought today would be a good day to begin that discussion in terms of, trying to narrow the list and have a little bit more direction. So we can actually start in terms of the first area where we group were facilities in terms of what is a definition of the classroom. And I think, Ms. Moore, this came up in discussions that we've had and also came up.
In order to assist with the discussion today, we looked at this issue closely because it is one that I have brought up over numerous occasions, and just looked at what are our needs as a state for our classroom, our learning spaces requirements, and then what do we fund at the state level, and are there issues around that? And as you can see on the first page of the handout, and hopefully there's some additional for the audience, we really looked at what needed to happen in the learning spaces, particularly as we move to more personalized education. The technology and connectivity, what should learning spaces be, the flexibility, and what are the resources within those classrooms. The Department of Education works with a classroom definition, and that is also provided in this handout. A little bit different than what is funded for classrooms in the sense that if someone does not meet our standard, which is $13.50 for kindergarten and $9.60 for regular classrooms, if they have an educational specification that says they need something different, we accept that. I think the funding program really does not. And just to kind of provide an example of that, on diagram 1, we have two types of potential learning spaces. On the left-hand side, the double-loaded quarter, so to speak, a traditional classroom environment, which we can easily count, I think, in our program, and traditionally this is what our program would fund. On the right, however, is a learning studio, and it looks very different. It actually can house the same amount of students that are on the left, but it's difficult for our program to really address this because we look at only, what a traditional classroom looks like in order to do so. We provided an additional example on diagram 2, where you see kind of a suite of different types of classrooms. Some might be 960 square feet, some might be 1,300, some might be 480. However, in our funding program, for instance, the learning space area of 2,700 square feet would receive the same amount of funding that we would for a 960 square foot classroom, because we're going to simply load 25 students into what we think is a space. So we see that as problematic moving forward, particularly as different educational environments are necessary for some districts. Some may want to have the traditional classrooms spaces that are in diagram 1 on the left-hand side. Some may want diagram 2. Diagram 3 is an actual specific example of how we weren't able to accommodate someone that really wanted to do individualized learning in an independent study type situation, because they didn't look like classrooms. And so we couldn't provide the funding for that. Particular example here in that. We've thought about what are the solutions to this. One might be that you do a square footage calculation, and the district or the local entity can use that or can be funded on it the same basis, and can use it in the manner that they need appropriately to arrive at their capacity. We think the program needs to be flexible to this issue as we move forward educationally. So that's what we offer to the discussion today, and look forward to other board members' thoughts on it.
On new construction, we fund per pupil grant as it is.
But we load it into a classroom. So, for instance, in the example that was given today, there were 500 students housed. There were 20 classrooms. If the 20 classrooms had not been in the project in the manner that we are used to seeing them, for instance, the left-hand diagram, we wouldn't have funded them.
So you don't fund just by numbers. You
don't fund by numbers. I think we originally began the program like that, but then we adjusted it over time to be classroom-based.
So is this included in the agenda packet for the public to?
We have ones available for the public as well. This was not prepared by the Office of Public School Construction staff. It was prepared by us after we received the agenda late Friday night.
And my guess is we'll talk about this more as we talk about eligibility, but I myself, because it not only impacts how you count it for new construction, but then it impacts how you count classrooms in the future based on what you have available and how many students you have. And so you either, if you don't use, so it's an eligibility issue when you're going to build the new school, and if you don't get it, then it's you have eligibility later. So I actually don't mind having an alternate where you would take a look at square footage per student. My only issue would be this, because we did an experiment like this back in the 70s. It didn't work out too well, and that is if a school wants to plan a different kind of program, based on technology or whatever, and wants to create a different learning space, I don't mind funding the square footage per student and letting them configure differently. My only issue would then be, one, if it doesn't work, that we don't pay to reconfigure, or we don't pay when it comes time to modernization, and it's not working, we don't pay to replace that school. I mean, I know in our district we actually replaced 3 schools that were built under these kinds of concepts that just didn't work. Now, in the future concept, they may, and they, obviously it was pre-technology era, but, if you're going to make that local decision, and they can run an effective program that way, I think it's fine. I don't think we should dictate at that level, because the whole intent of the program was, we're going to give you grant money and we're going to give you flexibility. I just think we have to be clear, though, that that's also not, we're not going to spend money twice in the future.
No, I completely understand that. I am not talking about moving back to open classrooms. What I am talking about is the flexibility to design large group instruction, small group instruction, different types of delivery models for education, which are happening right today, and not be constrained only to the traditional model. And I'm not saying the traditional model isn't appropriate as well. It's providing that flexibility in a manner that's acceptable to folks, and it's accountable, but it's still providing that local entity with how they need to deliver their educational model.
And I wasn't trying to suggest you were suggesting open classrooms. I was just using that as an example to say, if the model changes 20 years down the road, I don't think the state should have to pay to reconfigure or replace that school.
Well, we can talk a little bit about that, but I mean, look at our malls. They change every 10 years. I think that education is not that static. We have to be flexible for future changes that we haven't even conceived of yet, but not be too flexible that it's unusable space.
Well, I brought this up a couple minutes ago, too, where we've used, I see the bigger warehouses going up as tilt-ups, and then all the interiors are built out to suit, which are not load-bearing, they're not, anything like that, which is much easier to reconfigure as you change purposes. You may go from, as a community ages, it doesn't have as many kindergartens coming in, and so they may want to upgrade some of those lower classrooms, or change them out to bigger kid classrooms, or labs, or multi-purpose rooms. But the traditional way we've been building is these are supports-bearing structure walls. You can't do without major reconstruction, and I think that's something that we probably should hear from our state architects about how you could build 300,000 to 500,000 square foot without much load in the middle at all, and that way you give you complete flexibility as you go forward, and use it for a whole bunch of different purposes. And I hope that we encourage that kind of future thinking when we do these buildings.
So has design flexibility been a problem in funding?
And just if I could provide a little more background, there's I think two issues here. One, the Green Act provides specificity in terms of what to count in the gross classroom inventory. In the statute, there's a teaching station that's defined. It's further defined in regulations, and it's for the purposes of determining what is eligible. When we're just talking about eligibility, we look at projected enrollment. We compare that to the existing classroom capacity, where there's regulations that define what is a classroom. For example, spaces that are less than 700 square feet currently in the regulations are not counted as a classroom. So there's definitions on what is a classroom for purposes of determining the classroom inventory. Then that gets used to establish eligibility. We're talking right now about funding, which we've tried to use the same consistent approach that's in regulations about what is a classroom and fund the same thing. So there's two things. And I think this is a very important issue because there's been differences in the past. And I think it's due to a couple of things. One is that there's different guiding statutes, one of the Green Act, one of the Title V, and that they may not be consistent. Two is that sometimes we may not be looking at the same set of plans. And there's been situations in the past when we always take a look at the DSA plan approvals. Sometimes districts submit preliminary plans to the Department of Education, and before they get the final DSA approval, there's changes. So we may be looking at the different plan set. And then another issue that's come up is sometimes for us, when we read the plans, the classroom labeling may not be clear. And it may be just, it says exercise room or something of that nature, and we don't have the background that the Department of Ed has. So these are some of the issues that come up in the past where we've seen, these classroom count discrepancies. But we do have them right now in regulation in terms of the gross classroom inventory, and there has been issues with this in the past in terms of trying to come up with the same definition that the Department of Ed identifies as a classroom.
So if you took the example that we used earlier, you had 500 K through 6, I forgot what it was.
On the handout.
On the handout.
And diagram on the left, traditional classrooms, diagram on the right, a new. How would you count that?
No, but, what would you have to change for that school to say, hey, we have all our students housed, but we're still paying the same amount. We're just still doing per pupil grant.
Well, it's based on the 20 classrooms that are being built on that campus. And it's based on the loading standard. 25, this is an elementary, so it's 25 students per classroom. That's how you get to the 500 pupil grants that the district can request. So you have 20 classrooms. I think Ms. Moore was talking about some square footage that would also equate to that number. We haven't taken a look at that. I don't know how that could work.
But now, in today's world, you've got the diagram on the left and the right. So in today's world, for the diagram on the right, would we count that as classrooms? Do you need...
Well, my understanding of what we're talking about is that there would be a square footage of learning area, not the square footage of the school.
Well, I want to,
but-
how do
right?
we count it today?
We don't count it in that way. We count it based on the classroom definition of 960 square feet.
Yeah, we normally, I mean, we take a look at, well, on the right-hand side, the only example that I can come up with right now is in cases where you have a wood shop and you have the working area, but you have a separate classroom, a teaching station on the side, and that, for us, would consider one classroom.
Right. So I guess the point is, under today's rules, we take that, the square footage on the left, there's 10 classrooms, so we'd say that is, we'd expect 250 students that are loading a 25-to-1. But on the diagram on the right, even though that area, same square footage, was intended to provide learning stations or instructional space for 250 students, we would not count that as instructional space or classroom space because of the way it's configured.
Yeah, this would be 250, that would be 150 by the number of spaces.
Right. Well, actually, I don't think these count.
These are under
they're
700
under
square
960.
feet.
Yeah, we wouldn't,
Counts as,
if they're less than 700 square feet, we wouldn't,
So it counts.
currently, we wouldn't count them as
So
classrooms.
would you just take the big one? So
Yes.
One 25-person classroom.
So have we ever had a request like this come in that we had a problem with?
We have. Over the years, there's been several issues where we had a difference between funding and the CD plan approval letter.
you have close to 10,000 square feet here. So you'd never build a wood shop that was that big.
And part of the issue, I think, too, is overall in our program, because it's so well known that the funding example on the left is how it works, you're going to get less people that will come forward with any type of different design because they know it's not going to be accepted. So we head it off, we don't allow for that without a lot of extra work that someone would have to go through to try and see if that's possible. And for instance, the configuration in diagram 3 was one that we could not come to resolution about, and they were not able to design the school in the manner that they wanted to and that they believed was educationally appropriate. So, and it's not a personnel issue or a CDE versus OPSC issue. It's just how the funding program is set up right now to be a 960 box classroom based. And what we need to do is figure out a way that we can provide for that flexibility for all districts to be able to configure in the way that they need to and have the assurances, I think, as Assemblymember Buchanan said, that, somebody's two years later isn't going to come back and go, I don't want that anymore. And it's providing flexibility. And we thought, what is the solution? Why bring a problem forward if we don't have a solution? And we looked at, well, you could do it by square footage, and that way it's quantifiable for folks both at OPSC and CDE to be able to deal with.
If someone proposes the standard 960 square feet design, and they qualify, and we fund them at that level, I'm trying to figure out, I don't know that we hold them accountable to what they build anyway, just they don't have any more eligibility. So that particular box is 80 by 120, if they reconfigured it the way they wanted to after they qualified and say, we can house these 250 students based on these number of classrooms, do we go back after they build it and say, you actually built 20 classrooms, or are they providing educational services for 250 people, students?
Yeah, we take a look at the plans once they've been approved on DSA, and that's what we fund. We don't go back and...
And if you were to audit, you'd have a
Problem. Okay.
So I don't know, is there any consensus that we'd like staff to come up with potential alternatives on when we take a look at eligibility as to whether or not we can create eligibility where we would take a look at classrooms or instructional space per student?
Okay.
Take a look at it. Yeah.
We'd love to assist with that as well. And then I think, as Juan points out, I think then our, CDE and OPSC should be consistent in how we look at it. So if we need to change our Title V accordingly, so that we don't have conflicting standards for districts.
Well, I think it's both in terms of what we allow for construction, right, because they can still build, and two, how do we then deal with that eligibility not only today but going forward, so you don't end up with it paying twice.
We're going to cover the portable versus permanent.
No, but that's our next one. Would you like to start there, Mr. Hangman?
Well, I think it's kind of obvious that portable don't quite last as long as a permanent structure, and I'm totally for the flexibility of that permanent structure. Like I said, I think there should be 4 large low-bearing walls on the outside and everything else in between movable, but I believe we had problems with portable construction in the past, not having this full length of time lasting as long as our bond payments are on those bonds we paid to build them. And so therefore, I think we should at least require that the lifespan of the structure lasts as long as our bond takes to pay off.
I would question to what extent we should even be funding portables out of the state schools building fund, because if to build a portable school and then to pay to replace it later on, to me, doesn't make any sense. Now, if we were to, the other option would be to fund portables at a much lower rate, but when you fund portables and they're eligible for modernization after 20 years instead of 25 years, you're incurring modernization costs sooner. But I look at the program as being able to provide additional new permanent capacity for students. And what do we want to modernize or incentivize? And I think we want to incentivize new construction, and construction that's going to last decades, because we do want it so that you can. And I've never seen anyone who's really done a great job modernizing portables. Now, having said that, I think if we were to shift our direction, we also have to account for the fact that we still have, we've replaced do we know about what percentage of the portables out there we have replaced, because districts got caught between a rock and a hard spot back when class size reduction was implemented in 1997. I think we still have to find a way to finish replacing the existing portables that are there, whether we don't count them or what we do. But I do think we should be incentivizing permanent construction. And I do agree with Mr. Hagman that to the extent, we can't dictate this, but to the extent architects can make exterior walls, the weight-bearing walls, and do things like that, which fundamentally makes sense. That gives all schools much more flexibility over time.
I try to understand why schools choose to do the portables in the first place. I'm assuming, produces some savings on their financial assistance that they're receiving.
I think for most districts that I've been involved in and I've worked with, districts put in portables because they can't afford to build new construction, hard construction in general, or typically portables are also used for temporary housing and swing space during construction, and that's probably the best use for them, frankly, but that's not something that the state program funds. Districts pay for that out of their own. That's an allowable expense, but there's no money provided by the state for that. So it's, to be honest with you, most districts do it because they can't afford to build hard construction, and it may create savings on the back end, but they go into it trying to maximize the number of spaces that they can build with the limited funding
Wouldn't
that they
it
have.
create savings on the front end and costs on the back end?
Well, it does have some life cycle cost implications, I would say, yes.
And I would think, when you have the migration of students, neighborhoods that, grow older and such, you have the K-6s that have less students, and I see bubbles in the communities I lived in where the students go from K-6 to junior high to high, and then all of a sudden you have an older community where you don't need as many facilities, but it allowed them to adjust kind of the sites where the new families are moving into. But I think you could do that flexibility better long-term with maybe some traditional spaces like we saw in the drawing one, and then some of those bigger spaces with the portable walls in the middle that when you need them for classrooms, you build them out for classrooms for 8 years, 10 years, whatever, and then as that school ages, you don't have as many students coming in, you can open that up, and now it's a multi-purpose room or a larger library or a community room that you can use for something else. So you still have that permanent structure that could be useful in inventory past 15 years after you build the facility, but you don't have basically these portables that aren't usable after about 15 or so years, and they just kind of, I've seen some horrible ones walking into my local district, and I think that's what I want to avoid is paying 30-year bond money on something that's going to last them 10 or 15 years and cost the school district more money. But I think you allow that flexibility in that design originally for that site so that these buildings can be retasked, repurposed. And even if it's a joint venture or joint use, even with the city or something like that, that school only needs half its size anymore because the student population has decreased, but now you have a whole other field. Now you can use that larger facility for indoor programs at the school. You can use the fields for athletics. There's a lot of different retasking you can do to help pay for them as you go. But I think you kind of have to allow that in design structure and have that ability when you get those grants out originally. But I don't really see a reason why you need portables anymore at this point, except for maybe temporary housing while you build. Then you're going to rent them or lease them anyway.
I say neighborhoods, if you have a brand new development, you have a big bubble that goes through, right? And then you're right, the kids graduate from high school, the parents stay in the home, and so enrollment goes down. But then what happens is the parents decide they're going to move, they don't need the big house anymore, and the neighborhood recycles, and your enrollment goes up again. So you end up with a cycle. So it's not where you just can move a portable from one area to another. It's usually those neighborhoods recycle, and you may have some classrooms empty for a period of time, but then the kids come back.
I think, prior to 1998, we had a statewide policy that said 30% of your classroom space will be in portables. And it was for the very reason that folks believed that there would be those high growth periods. But then when they diminished, those buildings could move off and you could have a community center or something else, perhaps. We didn't see it as readily, but that is why you have why you have a lot of the amount of portables that exist out there today, because we had a state policy that required them at that time, prior to 12 years ago.
It was portables or relocatables, as I recall.
Right. It was, and
because there's a difference between the.
And I will say, in high growth districts, you did relocate buildings periodically.
Well, some portables, if you were caught, but the relocatables were essentially they're permanent. I know we've got the gentleman from Saramark here. You've got steel, steel framing and everything. You don't really relocate those built. They're called relocatables, but you don't really relocate them.
One other thing to add,
relocating is too expensive.
Madam Chair, is that under the SFP, school districts that have over 25% of portables compared to the permanent structures, we don't count those portables. Whatever is above the 25% are not counted as classrooms available. But they have those in terms of eligibility to replace them. So they have sort of additional eligibility to replace those portables. But this is only in cases where there's over 25% of the portables, 25% of the permanent buildings. Again, and those don't get counted as far as the classroom capacity, because again, the classroom capacity would take a look at what do you have available to house students. But if you have a lot of portables, they don't get counted, and districts could have extra eligibility to replace them. It's the only case, a new construction, that you can you can replace portables with new permanent buildings aside from the overcrowded relief grant.
Have you seen a lot of usage of those in the last 5 years or so? Are people still utilizing portables?
I think we do see a lot of projects.
The figures that OPSC has from the PIW, about 5% of the square footage built statewide since 2008 is in portables, and there's another about 6 or 7% in what's called modular buildings. So modular buildings are panelized or constructed off-site and then assembled on the site, so in concrete or steel frame. And the portables are any building that can be relocated that has a floor attached to it is part of the definition, and that can be transported over a public street, and then that's set. That's a portable or a relocatable. Modular buildings are site-built using prefabricated components.
And I know we always have to like to see the architect themes go through schools and such, but yeah, I guess one of the questions I would have as we go out and look at 2014, how much is out there? How much is there a need to replace? Is there, almost like a separate funding mechanism for that? And would you do it in conjunction? Because again, I think there are life cycles of schools. Those schools who don't need it today may need it in 10 years when those older families move out and younger ones move back in. And those who have the need today may not use it in 10 years from now because those families move on. So that flexibility, maybe a special thing just for a certain percentage, 20%, 10% of a school, that is more like that retaskable room. Instead of portables now, there would be a retaskable, I don't know how large, but that you can turn into a community student later, and maybe be creative with that. Can you do joint ventures with the local community for it? So they may not have it now, but they want to replace the portables with permanent construction or structures. They can use this community center until it rotates up, but we still leave it on our books as eligible classroom space, and that would be their decision. So they can't say, well, I'm using it for a community building now I have, 10 more classrooms coming in. I don't know, just be creative on that part.
I think there are two issues here. One is, do we want to fund the truly portable classrooms? The ones you wheel on and that last. They may be eligible for modernization after 20 years, but I've been in some that have been there for 5 years that don't look very good. So do we want to incentivize portable classrooms? I personally say no. I think the program should be incentivizing new construction.
I don't think you could justify spending 30-year bond money on something that's not going to last 30 years.
So I guess we've got consensus on that. Secondly, we're going to have to deal with eligibility for existing portables because, how you count a school with 25% versus a school with 10%. Ultimately, the portables you have, if we want to have permanent construction, are going to have to be replaced. And the third issue that Senator Hagman brings up is design, and I'm not sure that's a portable issue. I think that may be more of a getting back to the eligibility question we talked about first in terms of how we count classroom space, because if a school district does utilize, design, so you've got outside weight-bearing walls and enrollment goes down and it uses it for other purposes, that still should be counted in terms of eligibility as classroom space longer term. So if the neighborhood, turns over again and enrollment increases, that should be classroom space that stays in the eligibility count. So.
And wouldn't we also roll in the issue of modernization of portable buildings into the, we'll talk about that under modernization,
exactly
because
right.
I think that's another topic that's
right.
We should be.
Okay, so moving along here, I think we've got two questions down here in eligibility. How can the current method of determining eligibility and projecting future needs for school facilities be improved? Should the baseline eligibility be reestablished? I think we've talked a little bit about the first part of that question. The baseline eligibility be reestablished, I had that on here, and I actually believe that we should, with the new bond, reestablish. We'll take questions when we finish, if that's okay. I do believe with the new bond, we should be reestablishing eligibility.
Are you suggesting through an inventory system that we would do that?
That's exactly right.
Great.
And the reason, there's two reasons. One is, I do believe we should have an inventory. It's crazy that the state, like California, doesn't. And secondly, we established well over a decade ago, we went through the largest housing bubble in history. We've got eligibility that's, established based on some housing projects that may or may not, they still have tentative maps, may or may not be here, but I think it would make sense to establish a new baseline. And I also believe that if eligibility is strictly due to a new area, okay, not infill, where I think I would agree with you, Ms. Moore, in terms of infill, where you spend your eligibility, ties in with how you're going to assign school boundaries and everything else. So I think you should have complete flexibility there. But if you have eligibility just for a new 10,000 home development that's going in, I think that eligibility needs to stay with that development. But
we can talk about that further. I would just say that I think it's very difficult in districts to manage school construction by development. You cobble together numerous developments to produce a high school, a middle school, sometimes an elementary school. It's much easier on an elementary school basis, but I would be very careful. I think we should be very careful about aligning the school construction to particular developments. What happens when only 200 students come out of a development, and where do they get to go to school if you can't create another school for them?
No, I think the question is, should the eligibility should follow those students so that you're using the eligibility to house the students in the new development when you're talking about new developments versus when you're talking about the infill kind of eligibility that you have?
I would be open to obviously discussing it further. I'm just saying you start limiting what districts can do to developments, it becomes a much more complex issue. Now, we're not having the growth that we had during our last 10 years or probably 20 years of extreme growth in areas in California, but it's just that's starting to put money on a student and following it to a specific site. And we don't do that at the state level right now with what we provide out to school districts. We don't follow that money necessarily always to the exact specific site. We let them determine eligibility district-wide. So
how would you respond to a parent, if you were a school board member, and you had a development that generated 2,000 new students, and they've got to transport their kids 5 or 10 miles to overcrowded schools, going to maybe 5 or 6 different schools, and they say, well, wait a minute, we paid our developer fees, we have eligibility, and you say, well, we used it to build multi-use rooms in these 3 schools.
Is that happening?
Yeah. It's very,
And it's tough. I'd say from local example, from my district, I have 2 cities, Chino Hills in it, where they projected a much larger growth than what they actually got. So they actually built the school, but only maybe 1/10 of the housing came in. Those residents who bought into those houses said, we wanted the new school open because that's what you promised us when we bought the house, even though 90% of them were not built. So they ended up shutting down 2 other schools in a different city and busing some of those students to a new school, which is newer facilities, but now they're actually traveling quite a bit further, more students are, just to keep those new residents happy. It is an issue, and then we basically have 2 or 3 facilities vacant, even though we built a brand new one. Because we could call it a little bit migration, but that's where the management system comes in. Were they eligible? Should they be that way? Maybe the population has increased, but it's moving. All these different questions are there, but then it comes back to what do you do with the vacant facilities. We put one adult day class in it, now the facility is used, but it's really not being used.
No, completely agree that there were situations, I think, that we were all caught off guard when, with the declining economy and the declining amount of housing that occurred, and some of the prospective planning. So there's probably some schools out there that are not at maximum capacity and or closed. Hopefully they'll come back within the next round of growth that we experience in the state. And I think we could talk with folks that have dealt with this issue and get a better idea. It's a little bit like the Colonel Mello-Rooses, I would say, in my mind, where the money just stays in that Mello-Roos district only for those houses that happen in that Mello-Roos district, perhaps that are created around a development. But in terms of for a school district, it's very hard to manage at that micro level. Students just don't show up 30 per classroom easily out of developments that create these schools. So open to how it might work, but cautionary on it.
Okay, so on that, I'm hearing there's consensus on reestablishing eligibility, and in terms of dedicating eligibility to new development, we want to take a look at that, but we want to know what options are, and I guess ultimately have more discussions on that.
So in regard to dedicating eligibility for certain developments, is that a legislative issue, or is that something that we, at the allocation board, could resolve?
Legislative?
What do you, legislative?
I think so.
And then the other question was, does the current method of including dwelling units and eligibility projection work? How can it be improved? So I think most would probably agree that it works, but if there are any suggestions, I don't know if does anyone have any comments on that question? No? Okay, moving on. Is the current method of calculating the grants, which is the per pupil plus the supplemental grants, working? And I think part of this came up because when you take a look at the example that you have, which I know the example sort of throws in everything, including the kitchen sink, that you don't always have. I'm trying to figure out page 25. But the question there is, can we eliminate or simplify some of the or consolidate some of the programs? I mean, if there are supplemental grants that clearly are now required by code and all schools have to have them, then it would certainly make sense to me just to have roll it into the base grant. If there are some that are unique and a low incidence more occurring, then it wouldn't make sense, I don't think, to have them in. But I think what we'd like to do, the discussions we've had, is try and consolidate as much as possible.
Well, and quantify it. I mean, I would really like to see, I guess if we get more PIWs filled out, we'll be able to figure out more of the cost, but the original cost per square foot that we're seeing just some very sample things are horrendous. I mean, really, up to close to $500 a square foot. We don't see that anywhere. So I would like to even try to go further and say, is that a regulation bring up those costs? Is it materials? Is it location? And that's not counting site work. So, can we at least understand that portion of it too? But how do you say all these fees should or shouldn't be in there unless you could actually attribute it to the actual costs and see if it's verified? That's why I'd love to just get 10 samples up and down the state, North, Central, and Southern California, and say, okay, let's actually pull the records, independently look at and do audit on them. How much are we paying? Is it going to cover these costs? Is it too little, too much? Where's the expense going to? Can we streamline anything to help get better? I think I saw somewhere where the numbers were like half that rate in other states, construction school. And when they had the same earthquake-proof or hurricane-proof or things like that, I don't know. But it's hard to compare apples and oranges if we don't have something down there, but we don't even have the description what these costs really are going to, just a number.
Well, I certainly would agree to consolidation. I think some of these came incrementally over time as codes changed, like, for instance, sprinklers, so that if there's things that we could move into the base grant and make it easier for folks, I think that's a good idea.
So we have consensus, and you can look at that and bring it back. And I've got to flip back here to page 8 again. And then miscellaneous. We've talked about as we're winding down the current program, but bond authority being reserved for a project at the time an unfunded approval is granted. We've got current regulations that say you use it or lose it type. I guess whether we want to continue with that. The second bullet, Mr. Hegman, I think, is how often is funding been provided through the program for real property or facilities that are no longer being used or were never developed. And then the third bullet being the database. So,
discussion about those at all?
Yeah.
Well, I do have a bill, I'll see how far it goes, but basically says that if the state is either 50% or more investor in the last 10 years of a piece of property or facility, and that facility no longer is needed, and there's either sold or leased out for a non-education function that brings income, which I fully encourage school districts to do that, then treat us like equity partners. We should be getting part of that money back into the bond system. I don't want to discourage the use of these sites, but at the same time, if we're paying on these things for 30 years on bond dollars and they're not being fully utilized for the purpose of what we paid for, or the land bank, that's where we kind of need to inventory a little bit to know what's out there and how it's being utilized. Then I'd like to see the state gets part of its money back and encourage them to lease it out, use it, whatever the case may be.
The third bullet is the inventory,
Right. The third bullet is the
kind of
inventory.
discuss that, right?
If we start at the third, are we all in agreement that we'd like to have a statewide database inventory?
Yes.
Well, it's a good idea, but are we suggesting that it be housed at OPSC and
I've been pushing that for a long time. It makes sense.
I think it would make sense to me to have it at OPSC.
so that would require some additional funding.
Right.
Can you utilize the funds right now for that purpose with board direction?
Well, I mean, you obviously have to develop a FSR, which is a feasibility study, to determine what the parameters would have to be in order to capture data and do an inventory system. I know community colleges has established an inventory system that took 10 years to put together. You can learn from other folks and what their challenges have been, and we have had conversations with them. I know costs have been, we've been touch on some cost. We've heard costs could be somewhere around $20 million as a base. So it all depends. I know part of our system is we have to be able to have and establish that inventory and create a system where we can feed it.
Well, and I was saying this before, I see anything like this for monitoring purposes shouldn't be punitive to districts. It should be something that will augment the districts to help the districts. Something they would want to use and utilize to help their facilities maintenance and scheduling program, all the rest of it. The community college system that we've been shown, I don't believe costs that much, and it was done outside of the community college system with private donations, I know, but it shouldn't take that much money or that much time to actually build. It's not that much put into it, but it's a system that maybe can be basic system start off with and then add modules, and maybe the districts can put in their wish list of what they like to see for those modules as they go forward. But in order to say, hey, you have 7 vacant pieces of property within your district and you have this many actual sites and they're at this capacity each and they're this old, I mean, some really basic information so we could come up with some kind of direction where we want to go, A, policy-wise, B, what bond amounts, where we should put those funds. I mean, right now, if someone asks me, you want to put a bond together? Yes, I would like to see the program go forward. I have no educated guess of what the amounts of the bonds should be. One, there wouldn't be enough either way, but even what categories to put them in, there's no data for that to even get started. So, I mean, to have some of this basic information, this should be mandatory, to say the least, but how are we supposed to make educated decisions as legislators or advocate for one thing or the other unless we have some of this basic data? Is there something you can put together, just a scope, and then send it out and get some private bids even, and just so we even know what realm it would be as far as cost?
Well, a lot of the system that we built internally is something we've done with our in-house folks. You're talking about a whole statewide data system which will encompass over 10,000 facilities, if not more. So, I mean, there is a way that we can capture data, and we do that intuitively with the project information worksheet. So you obviously have to build beyond that, because you're going to have to create set criteria in order to ensure that we're all using and feeding the beast the same way. So, again, that's something that we could establish internally as a focal point for discussion, but you're right, it's going to involve a lot more discussion.
Yeah, and it depends at what level of data detail we would want about the facilities, whether it's a very high level, number of buildings, age, or...
It seems to me the community college system would be ideal, because the way they've added on with modules, I mean, you could really figure out what your cost of maintenance is and everything else, because they're very detailed in terms of, they get down to electrical outlets and everything else. I think we need to start out with something high level. I mean, when people take a look at the data that we have, we really don't even know how many classrooms we have and how old the classrooms are. And it seems to me that we ought to start out with some sort of inventory that is high level, that makes sense, so we know what we have. And if you think about the fact that we spent over $100 billion between local and state funds over the last 12 or 14 years, and we spent that money and we don't have the information, it just doesn't make sense to me.
I know in our...
Oh, I'm sorry, I was going to say, my idea for Prop 39 didn't quite make it through, but about tying some of those things. But there is a reporting requirement on that. There's an initial assessment, there's what you did with that money, and then the final outcome with that, how did you work that? That is a requirement by the bond. I hate to see two separate systems. There's got to be a way to coordinate this stuff into one, make it easy, simple, utilize some of those resources in Prop 39. I believe there were in our bill that were taken back out, but I know the administration has a lot to input on this as well, especially next week or so. I would hope they would consider at least combining those efforts, if nothing else, to make sure we're not having multiple systems and multiple different state agencies trying to track different things and drive everybody else crazy. Have one database system that could be a modular. Prop $39 and upgrades could be a modular of the facility, base. So I hope they would consider that as things go forward.
Yeah. Another consideration is that if this is something that we really do want, it'd have to be a condition of funding and built into law.
Yeah.
It's not something that we could just ask for, and I think,
No,
because otherwise it's hit and miss.
I think if we thought it's important, we should create it as part of the new bond. I mean, I don't think we want to. I don't think we'd go back and do it now, but I do believe that it would make sense for us to know, have an accurate count.
And again, it shouldn't be punitive. It should be something that districts want to use because it helps their organization, it helps their existence and management of their own facilities they have. And so if you don't make those user-friendly things for them, no one's going to want to do it. You want to make them want to do it.
And it'd have to be at a very high level, because most of these large school districts, I got to believe, already have
and maybe we could
facility management systems and
some of their software
Are you
programs.
nodding, Eric?
and different
Which way, up and down or
platforms
sideways?
and-
Yeah.
Maybe we could use
different
theirs to start off
code.
with. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, just use the same wheel they have.
Well, there's probably 100 different wheels.
Well, I would say start off simple. If people find it useful, then they'll want to add modules. You won't have to have each district buying its own, but we should have some kind of accurate inventory.
I think Senator Hagman has a really good point. I think that when you're looking at ESCOs and a lot of the assessments that are happening right now through power purchase agreements, there is an assessment of different facilities. Private companies do have that information. Perhaps they're sharing it with school districts. If you're going to integrate, the two, that's key information that can be very helpful when you're getting this together as one study, rather than duplicating efforts. I think it would be sort of an addition to statutory requirements for those ESCOs to share sort of the assessments on what's going on with those facilities.
Well, I mean, there's no board, local school board, that would be doing these decisions about all the information we're asking for already. It's there. It's just uploading into a standardized format. I mean, I'm not going to be on the school board and say, yeah, I agree with this project or not, unless I'm looking at this stuff in much more detail than we are. So I'm hoping not creating too much extra staff. It's just having a one centralized database that we could actually look at trends. I mean, that 70-30 ratio, I don't have any faith in whatsoever in that. But I don't know what the ratio is. I have no clue. And then what's the need? Can anyone say really what, any in this room, say what the need is besides their own district? Statewide? No. And so how are you supposed to make informed decisions of where to go on this? So again, I hope that the Prop 39 discussions, especially in the budget coming up, is considered into that database solution, or at least can be upgraded eventually into the bigger picture. But I think it's something we should look into.
I would just offer three things. I think also it should be accessible or inputable by all the agencies, so that it's no longer three separate agency work, and that it should be able to be tagged for work like the energy work, so that it's all consolidated. Secondly, other states have done this, the largest of which I think is Florida, that could possibly provide examples for us as well to look at. And thirdly, that we had a working group that worked with best practices around this issue, particularly across the nation with the Council for Educational Facilities International, and we arrived at those big data points as you talk about. What are they? A list of about 20, and we gave that work over to Bill Savage as well. So he has our initial work on that, and you can build with that with stakeholders, I think, and others to look at what the data points are.
The people out there to figure it out.
Well, yeah.
Come back with suggestions.
I think we're going to try and. I don't think we can all do the legwork. We're ensuring full employment for staff here, so they can answer these questions for us, and make sure, because I think there's a consensus. I think what you're hearing is we're happy starting out with a high level. That we since we have multiple agencies that are involved with the school construction process, it would be great if there were some commonality here, so that you don't have one count and CDE another count and DSA another count. And that we recognize that we're not going to do it today, that it's going to have to be part of a new bond proposal. So in terms of what we can do, I agree with Senator Hegman in terms of if a school district came to us and we gave them 50% to buy for land acquisition, and then they sell that land and don't build the school, I do think that money should come back to the program. So, and he said a 10-year time frame. I think the 10-year time frame is reasonable. So, I would like to explore that. I'm getting nods. We've got consensus there. And then the first question, I guess, is I don't know if there's consensus there or not, but I do think even though we went to the, you have two opportunities and then you move off the list or move to you could have you move to the bottom of the list, but we did that now because we're running out near the end of the bond. But even if we're not near the end of the bond, I do believe that if you're on the list, it should be because you're ready to build. And so I would very much support our having, if we don't have the exact same policy going forward in the next bond, we do something very similar in terms of, you're on the list because you want to build, not because we're going to take up authority for long periods of time.
So are you saying more finalize what has been a temporary kind of system?
Yeah, and there may be some nuances or something in a new program that we need to consider on top of that. But I do believe that, again, you sell a bond, you don't want to reserve that money and have it sit there. You want it to go out to projects. So that pretty much is all we have on the parking lot items for new construction. Is there anything else that anyone wants to bring up?
Comment on that?
Yeah. Well, I was going to maybe do it on both, but in fact, I think I'm going to wait. Let's go through modernization, then we'll do public comment, because we have an hour until session starts. And so on modernization, maybe if we can go through it quickly and get to the parking lot items, that would be good.
Okay, so yes, the nice part about modernization is that you've heard much of the process in the new construction piece, so I'll try to hit the highlights that are unique to the program. So the modernization section, we're talking about our funding process, and we're beginning on page 27. And in some of our past meetings, we've already discussed that this is a 60-40 matching program, and that the eligibility requirements are that the buildings be at least 25 years old for permanent and 20 for portable, and that the eligibility is generated on a per pupil grant basis. So the funding, again, the grants are used to extend the useful life or enhance the physical environment of the school. So that's a good starting point there. But I'll jump into the two types of funding, and we have the design apportionment, which is on page 28. You can see the two types. We've got the design apportionment. Like new construction, this is funds provided in the beginning so that a district that has financial hardship status can hire design professionals and prepare the plans and specifications for the necessary state approvals. And then we have the adjusted grant, which is the full funding application piece of it. And the chart on page 28 shows the documents that are necessary for each type of funding application, and there are many similarities between this program and what Tracy went over with on the new construction program. But I did want to call your attention to one thing that is unique to modernization, and that is the architect's estimate for site development if the district is requesting funding for 50-year-old buildings. And that is necessary if the district is requesting costs to modernize the utilities for those buildings, because that does provide an additional grant amount, because sometimes you really need to get in there and start fresh with the utilities if the building hasn't been touched in 50 years. And that is done with the cost estimate basis, much like site development might be looked at for a new construction project. And the application process is also like new construction, where we do fund on a first-in, first-out basis and do the concurrent reviews of the eligible grants, looking at the funding application. And if there is a 50-year-old building request, then we would be looking at those costs at the same time as well. And a 15- and 4-day letter process is used for modernization as well. The funding formula is shown on page 30 and 31. We've got the current year pupil grant amounts there. We've listed the supplemental grants that may apply to a modernization project. And then I'd like to bring you to page 42. We'll jump into the form briefly and show you some of the different areas that a school district would be filling out to request the unique types of modernization grants as well. So again, this is the funding application. This is how the district is requesting the funding. The yellow highlight are the areas that apply to modernization. This is a multi-purpose form. It covers many of the different school facility programs. So some of the areas that a district fills out are going to be the same, such as a basic information type of project, things like that. And then we get down into, I'm on page 42, and you still fill out the section about what type of school it is on modernization projects. Oftentimes you're going to be answering no to many of the questions there. But we need to know things like where the site is being located. Is there additional acreage being required? Because modernization funds cannot actually be used for the additional acreage. So actually, section number 3, you'll see an opportunity for a 15-day letter there, because on our sample we've indicated that there are 2 proposed acres. This is something that OPSC would check for. Can't have proposed acres for modernization funding because statute doesn't allow the program to pay for it. So we would send a district a 15-day letter there and say, did you mean these are that you have existing acres available, 2 existing acres there? So that's an opportunity for a 15-day letter there. Also, on page 43, we get into the supplemental grants, and that is actually down on number 6. So it's going to be separate from the section where Tracy was showing you the new construction grants, but there are fewer supplemental grants for the modernization program. And they would be requested either with additional grants from things like the project assistance, which relates to the small schools. That's still eligible in this program. You've got your fire detection and alarm system, and then the high performance incentive points are also available here, and that works the same way for new construction. They generate points. It's on a different scale, but it's still applied on a percentage basis to the project. And then looking at the right-hand column there, where number 7 continues there, there's a section for the excessive cost hardship grants that relates only to the modernization program and charter school rehabilitation, which is similar type work. And it's a few different ones here. The geographic percent factor is similar. If they're in a difficult location to access, that still applies. Accessibility and fire code receives either a 3% increase to the base grant amount, or if a school district submits documentation outlining their actual costs, the actual work in the plans, then there's a 60% of the minimum work required, and that's done on the cost estimate basis, so that can be provided. And in addition, if elevators need to be installed to meet access compliance issues, then the district can indicate the number of elevators, and they get funds for that in addition to the additional stops in case it's more than one story. Small size project and urban are also applied to this amount. The urban grant is calculated slightly differently, but it's still for the same purposes in those sites that are maybe a little bit more difficult to construct on or to do the modernization project on. And then moving through the form, the certifications, beginning on page 44, the same sections are filled out related to the construction contracts, things that we would use to look at the prevailing wage or the LCP grant. And then the architect of record certifies in separate sections. On page 44, down in section number 21, there are different certifications that apply for new construction and modernization, so the district's architect's going to take a look at those things. One thing to highlight there is in a modernization project, the district's architect will certify whether there's been a change in the number of classrooms due to the modernization work, and that gets reported whether it's an increase or a decrease in the number of classrooms in case things have been reconfigured and now there's 3 extra classrooms on the site or 2 fewer. So that gets reported there. And then the several pages of certifications, like Tracy mentioned, it's going to be specific to the different type of project funding that you're requesting here, but it's important to take a look at all of those certifications. And then I think to bring you back to page 31, we'll talk about the program statistics, but while we're getting there, one of the other things I wanted to point out is in addition to what you think of as your traditional modernization project, there is also an opportunity for a school district to do a replacement of building area of like kind, where you can go a little bit deeper, and if the facility is not meeting your needs, actually demolish and replace the structure. And that is, it's allowable under the program, but the funding calculation doesn't change. So it's an option for districts, but it's still pupil grant based. There are supplemental grants that can go into it, but the actual type of project becomes a district choice. Yeah. And then on page 31, we've got the project data related to the supplemental grants versus the base grants in modernization. And there's no site acquisition to include on this chart, of course, since it's modernization. But looking at the top pie chart there, the split for where the state grant funds have gone is 79% have gone to the base grant, with 21% going to the supplemental grants. And then in the second pie chart down below, it goes clockwise with the most funding provided for the supplemental grants in order from, well, clockwise basically. So the 50-year-old buildings, those are a large grant. So you'll see an increase in the pupil grant for those, which is due to those pupils receiving a higher base grant amount. And then the next highest would be urban, and then our accessibility and fire code requirements, and then so on from there. And with,
okay.
You guys have questions?
Anyone have any questions? Because if not, we're going to move on to the parking lot items, which are on page 32. And the first category under facilities, is there an allowance for modernization of portables, or there is an allowance for modernization of portables, and does it work? And I I think from the new construction conversation we have, what we want staff to do is to take a look at how if we want to incentivize permanent construction, how we deal with replacing the portables going forward. So what our options are there. And then does the current method of calculating modernization eligibility work, and what are the challenges? And my comment or issue there, and I don't know if I was the one that put it on the parking lot or who did, but bless you.
In threes, let's see.
Threes, okay. We're done. No more. And that is this, we give the modernization grants on a per-student basis. And if a school is underutilized, then you potentially have a situation where, and I know we're doing it district-wide, but say a school has 3 wings, does it really make sense to modernize 2 of them and not the third? Or depending on how many special day students you have, it costs the same to modernize whether you have 10 students or whatever the maximum number of students are. So I don't want to open up the floodgates, but at the same time, I do think there is some efficiency if you're going to modernize a school to go in and completely modernize that school. So, and I know you can use eligibility across schools, so that complicates the issue. But the question is there, what should we be doing there?
Madam Chair, just to clarify, under the modernization program, it is site-specific.
Okay, you're right. That's true. You're right.
Well, not to throw a wrench into it all, however, having lived this a long time, I'm not so sure that our criteria of 25 years is really the indicative criteria for need. There can be a 25-year-old building that has been well-maintained and is in great shape, and the district is satisfied with it, and there can be a 25-year-old building that's in very poor shape, and the district is not satisfied at all with both the systems and the educational environment. We don't look at this program as a systems and educational program. We have granted great flexibility to districts to utilize whatever the ADA amount is to the site, and I'm not so sure if that's the best approach. It could be, but I'd love to hear from others about that approach. There's other ways to fund modernization work, and that's actually funding what is necessary. If the roof's gone, if the boiler's gone, what's the cost of that? What's the state willing to pay for their side of it? And what can you move forward on? Or other approaches that other entities utilize. We just received a report about indoor air quality being poor in school facilities statewide, and that's a real modernization issue. That's how is the airflow working in the learning spaces, and other entities are saying it's not working well. Should we address that issue? It's an educational issue, and maybe it needs to be addressed before other issues are addressed on a campus. So I think modernization could have a lot of looks at what's eligible and what do we fund.
And we have to also remember that, we have limited resources, limited dollars to distribute, and so we haven't fully funded needs, and we're not going to. So, it does have to be an allowance or a calculation that allows the money to be extended as wide as possible, so it's fair. And, you get to the point where you feel that you have to fully fund a need, that's that many fewer projects that get funded. So that's
my issue is this. When a school district decides to build a school, it makes certain decisions. And to come back 25 years later and say, well, we really wish we would have designed it this way instead of that way because it'll better meet our educational needs, to what extent should the state be on the hook for those decisions? You know, so
But educational program changed in the 25 years, and the state changed it. So I think that there is some, and whether people believe that we should use modernization dollars to educationally reconfigure is one piece, and whether we utilize it for good indoor air quality is another piece. And
right. I guess where I'm going, though, is that I believe ultimately facilities are the responsibility of the local school districts and communities and not the responsibility of the state. And the program is here to help the state be a partner with the local communities. But ultimately, the decisions in terms of what you're building, the quality, and everything else rests with the local communities. And you know, the reason that I like incentivizing permanent construction is because I think it's a good decision, so we can talk about what we incentivize. But I think you're opening a huge Pandora's box if we just say, a district can say, you know, educationally we'd like to move from 960 square foot classrooms to the other, so we're going to tear it down and build a new building. I just don't know how you do that and work within the economics of a program. And there was a time when, because I know our district was caught in this, Bill's district may have been caught as well, where if you did want to tear down a building, you know, we had one that was an old pod-shaped building that was horrible, and build a new building, you had to pay back any funding you got from the state to build it, even if it were 50 or 60 years ago, and then you couldn't receive modernization funding. And then those rules changed so that you can, you know, you replace and you can get the modernization funding, whatever you would get. You just don't end up with eligibility for new construction. So I think there's some flexibility there. I just don't know how you how you deal with that.
And can I bring up one more thing to the question, too? Especially in the last few years with the budget tightening and giving more flexibility to districts, and the proposal right now to give even more flexibility, at what level do you hold the local district for maintaining the current buildings you have? If a building's supposed to last 40 years and it's falling apart in 15 because no one replaced the roof or did something like that, is that something we should be responsible for?
I would love to revisit our requirement that we had to maintain 3% for deferred maintenance and maintenance over time.
No.
But we eliminated it. And so, I mean, not we, the collective we, during the budget process. And I think that it will have a consequence for school districts. And because it was, so to speak, categorical, it went for that use. Now it's flexed, so it can or cannot go for that use.
And even if you don't categorize it, let's say the new proposal goes through, there is no categories, even for maintenance, which I think would be a mistake, but I don't have a lot to say in the budget. Again, you're paying 30-year bond money. Should we step in at all in the first 30 years? We'll build a facility now, and in 20 years it needs something. Are we responsible for that at all? We're still paying on that first mortgage payment on that bond before we even start doing it. So is the 20-year, 25-year-old, you know, what level of that increase is there, and does the districts have enough to maintain those buildings and facilities? So when I was on the council, a mayor, we built a brand new city hall. We started that year putting away replacement dollars 40 years from now to replace it. And we do that for our vehicles, all the rest of it. So we're able to do that in our budget. So I know the school districts have been really tight, but are we going to set a line in the sand, so to speak? Or what happens if the school district comes in and the building's only 20 years old and it was either just a really bad weather, you know, termites coming in, you know, something that wasn't maintained, all of a sudden that roof is now a public safety issue. Do we still step in? I mean, those are the questions I have. I mean, you know, it's easy to say it all should fit one category, but it's not. And how much do we hold the school accountable versus how much we protect those students who actually need a good school environment?
In the cases where they do have a health and safety They come in under the facility hardship program. There has been questions on those type of projects and whether the maintenance could have prevented the issue, but if there is a health and safety, they can come in for funding now under that separate program, even if they don't qualify for modernization, if the buildings are under 20 or 25 years old.
But it seems like if you're going to spend $100 billion on construction in 10 years, and you don't have a database to know what's out there in the first place, and no oversight to know if those buildings are being maintained, and the full open-ended under the emergency grant relief, basically unlimited, not unlimited, but potentially unlimited need because they're not, would it not be wise to at least assess it every now and then to make sure that your investment that you're doing, the $100 million campus you put together or something like that, 5 years, maybe every 5 or 10 years, and 99.99% of the school district is going to do a great job. It's that 0.01% that we may have a problem with. Maybe they don't have the personnel, they don't have the resources to watch and maintain it, and not do the not have the board support to spend those kind of funds on maintenance, and all of a sudden that big investment now is not there. What's our responsibility? What's our role?
This is the problem, and certainly requiring the 3% contribution of a district helps. But we built a high school in our school district that cost us about $120 million. If you put 2% a year away for maintenance, which is the rule of thumb, then you'd put $2.4 million into a sinking fund every year so you could maintain the school. If it were 1%, it would be $1.2 million. Our school district general fund budget is roughly $200 million. There are 4 high schools. There are, I forget how many middle schools, and all your elementary schools. There is no way you can put away 1 or 2% a year out of your general fund budget and still have teachers in the classroom. It's just, if you just take a strict look at the math, it just doesn't work. So what happens is, by the time the schools are 25 years old, chances are the AC is working, it's limping along because it probably should have been replaced, I don't know, you probably know better than I do, after 15 years, but the district didn't have the money to replace it. You should be, whether you do stucco or whether you do wood, you should be repainting every so many years to maintain the water seal on your buildings. But back when I was on the board a while ago, at that point in time, to paint an elementary school is around $60,000, $65,000. So when you take a look at what it costs to maintain, and you take a look at the district's budget, I don't think it's that districts don't want to do a better job and put more money into it, it's that they can't. And I'm not sure the state is able to fully do that either. So my proposal would be that districts be allowed, and I don't think routine maintenance should be funded through general obligation bonds, because then you're paying for 25 years for work that lasts a much shorter period of time, and that's not a smart way to finance either. My own belief, and I don't know where we get here because there's a whole lot of people to talk to, but we ought to be considering as a separate measure expanding the 55% authority for parcel taxes strictly for school maintenance. Not if we can't get it for everything, which the polling doesn't look great, but if we had the ability to pass a parcel tax for maintenance, then we could do a much better job of protecting the taxpayers' investments in its schools, and ultimately we would reduce our modernization costs when the schools turn 25 years old, because we wouldn't have the dry rot in the framing because we couldn't afford to fix the roof. So, I really do think that we're going to have to take a look at a different model if we want to do the kind of job we need to do maintaining.
Well, we have, in Berkeley, where I live, we have a parcel tax dedicated to maintenance that we passed with a 2/3 majority, and it has made a huge difference in the quality of the schools, in the ability to provide vehicles and tools for the workers. It's critical, so I think that's a great idea to look at for making this happen.
So if we go back with eligibility, my question is, I'd like you to take a look at and give us some numbers, okay, because you corrected me, we're right, the eligibility follows the school, follows the students in the school, but when the eligibility and the classroom count don't match, should we, have some kind of eligibility where when we go in, we actually modernize the whole school? Now, if you're only using half of it, I don't know what the threshold would be, but one of the things we do is we penalize schools if they're not at full capacity, even though it costs the same to modernize, and I think if you're going in, you want to actually get the job done for the whole school. So
I would agree with you wholeheartedly. So if you're asking for that, I second it.
I mean, just as an option, I don't know how much more it would cost or whatever, but I do think, it doesn't make sense to me.
You'd be looking at an assessment to do a whole facility modernization, like a retrofit?
Well, yeah, I'm saying if you go in and say your school has capacity for 720 students, but your current enrollment is 650, you're 2 years down the road, you could have 720, but you're going to embark on your modernization project today, and you're going to do that much less work because you're not at capacity today. And so I don't think we want to have a disincentive to do the work that we need because it costs the same amount of money. No.
Then one more thing, again, back to the Prop 39 dollars. What happens if you're doing part of that Prop 39 energy efficiency? How do you connect that to some of these dollars? Use the example, if you want to put solar on the roof, but all of a sudden the roof's not supportive enough for construction of that, Prop 39 won't pay for the rebuild of the roof, but you probably should, because at the same time going to modernize that roof, modernize that facility. And that's the problem when you start having multiple agencies give out multiple different funding grants. You cannot coordinate them as well. And so I would definitely encourage, again, the administration to look at the possibility of trying to run all these through one agency so you can do economy of scale when you do projects.
So you're suggesting that the calculation be based not on pupils, but on square footage?
Yeah, and I don't know, it could be, if you're only using half the school and you're leasing or whatever, I don't know where the sweet spot is there. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that when you go out and you put out a contract, if you're going to modernize, you should modernize all the classrooms. You shouldn't have a separate contract, down the road. We should be upgrading the entire school. And maybe it's not feasible, I don't know, but
Sounds expensive.
Well, it may or may not be, but I think it's good over time. It's cost effective, and maybe there's limitations in terms of how you're going to do this. But I would at least like us to look at it. We may reject it, but I'd like us to look at it. And then the funding, we have the percentage of modernization grants provided or used for hard construction grants, what percentage, and is the current pupil funding grant model still appropriate? And I think that was a little bit covered in my eligibility question, but is there any comment on either of those?
Well, I would still comment, and if there is interest by the board, we have a per ADA model, again, for modernization, and in some cases, a square footage you can make a choice, right, between doing it by student and by square footage. Is that correct?
To calculate the eligibility, yes.
Oh, eligibility only, okay.
Yes.
But is there any desire to really know what the systems are that need to be updated or that are at their life cycle cost, and cost that, and whatever percentage this, I realize the state, and I'm a part of the state having limited resources, but it's one thing to do per ADA without any kind of needs analysis for what that particular site might need to do to bring their systems up to current day. Or do we simply stay with a per ADA amount and give, the flexibility to the district to determine where they want to spend that funding?
Well, maybe you can come up with an example for us. I don't know how you cost something like that out, especially with the database we don't have.
Well, I mean, it's, I can give you the example of the Department of Defense. They went in, they analyzed every site, they determined what the cost was on their system, what the life cycle cost of the systems were, what the cost would be to update those systems, and they looked at whether they were meeting educational requirements. For instance, if they had no multipurpose room, which I know is probably beyond where we are, but they looked at that. They arrived at a cost figure, and because of their particular program, they looked for a 20% match from the state or from locals. But they actually were funding actual work. And it differed every site, because different sites had different needs.
But one, we don't have standards. I mean,
It takes away all the flexibility.
And two, we rely on locals to develop their own local standards, and we give them the flexibility under new construction to make decisions. So you got to ask yourself how much managing we want to do at the state level and what we want to spend money on. But I'm open to if there's any way to. At least we can certainly.
Well, maybe
have
we can look at
talking
this
about it more.
and bring back any possibility around there. The one piece that I continue to think about is that when we have reports that come out and say indoor air quality is poor, should we be addressing indoor air quality first of all? I mean, how do you learn in an environment that has poor indoor air quality? How do you learn in an environment that has poor lighting? How do you learn in an environment, that is cold or hot? And those are systems issues. So we can certainly look at that and provide information to the board.
Okay. I think that's it, unless there's something else anyone wants to bring up under modernization. Okay, so we'll take questions, and I'd like to ask you to. We have both the California Small Business Association luncheon, where the two of us need to be over to the convention center, and we have a session that starts at noon. So we'd like to take public comment and.
Chairman, members of the board.
You need to speak into the mic so it can be recorded. Yeah, if you sit down in the chair and speak into the mic, that'd be great.
Okay, all right. I like
Thank
to
you.
stand up and talk.
Yeah. So we're all in the same.
Okay, am I on?
Equal.
Okay. All right. Good morning. My name is Michael Knapp. I am the Chief Operating Officer of Saramark Incorporated. Saramark is a constructor of learning environments. We build with a 50-year design life. But I'm here today as chairman of the School Facilities Manufacturers Association. And with the board's indulgence, I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about the state of the construction industry in school construction.
If you could be as brief as possible, and then you can always provide us with a follow-up letter, that would be great, because I'm sure there are other people in the audience who also have comments.
I will be brief.
Thank you.
I want to talk about the perceptions of portables versus where the industry is. And I think the term portables comes from the experience that many of us have had directly, or our children have had, in what were portable buildings, portable classrooms constructed during the 70s and 80s in particular, when we had such a boom. The industry has really evolved beyond that, and there is a whole gamut of types of facilities that are constructed for schools. Yes, there are still portables, and portables are a mobile home type of manufacturing. They are not really meant to be permanent, and indeed they are portable. But that's a small part of the industry today. The next kind of evolution, and it evolved from portables, is what the industry would call modulars. These facilities are built to be permanent, although they are brought to a construction site, having been fabricated in a factory, put on a truck, and trucked out. Could they be moved? Yes. Are they meant to be moved? No. The next gamut up is kind of what is called panelized and prefabricated, which is what Saramark does. These are permanent facilities, meant to be permanent, but a portion of them are constructed in a factory as well and brought to a site. And finally, there is what everybody is familiar with, the stick-built approach. That continuum of types of facilities also has a continuum of costs. Each one is slightly more expensive than the next, or slightly less expensive than the next one up. So the term portables, which is used because of I think all of our personal experiences growing up, when applied to the industry as a whole and all those different types of construction, is really inaccurate. And I want to just take this brief time to bring that to the board's attention as to, when we're starting to write regulations, that we take into account there is a evolving construction industry which continues to improve the ability to provide learning environments to schools.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we're all familiar with the difference between the types that you discussed. So,
okay.
Thank you.
So,
is there any other comment?
Look out.
He's bound and determined, isn't he? It's basically portable or relocatable is what you get down to.
Good morning. I'm Kathy Allen. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Facilities for Sac City Unified School District. Just another little comment about the concept of, our 3% match or contribution that went away. It's very frustrating to have to tell somebody, a principal, that, I can't fix your roof right now, but if it falls down on you, then I'll be happy to replace it with my bond money. And then the 55% parcel tax would be an awesome thing, but again, I don't think it's equal all the way across the board. So I think you're going to find some districts that will embrace that wholeheartedly, and you'll find some districts that will never pass a 55% parcel tax to fix schools. I mean, you're always going to be pitted against teacher and teacher salaries and in the classroom. So,
that doesn't come up. I mean, that would be dedicated. It wouldn't be teacher salaries.
Right, but if you have two things on a ballot, and one of them is for teacher salaries and one of them is to maintain your schools, I guess it depends on where you're at, but one's probably going to do better than the other one. I just think that if there was a way to equitably assure that districts are making some kind of commitment to their maintenance and operations, and then anything on top of that, such as a parcel tax that would be dedicated for additional funds, that would be wonderful. But maybe that baseline would be preferable. And then one other little comment about indoor air quality, Ms. Moore, because you brought it up. We have a lot of Project Green things at Sac City, which we're very fortunate to be able to do. But a good example of where it doesn't work quite like we think it would, we were getting ready to replace windows in one school site, and because they were operable windows, all of a sudden, a lot of other mandates kicked in, ADA compliance, and so we had the choice of changing them to non-operable windows, which we didn't really want to do because of indoor air quality issues. So now we're only going to do half the windows in the school. And hopefully we'll find some money to do the other half a little bit later. But I just wanted to piggyback on that because it was a good article in the paper, and it did bring up a lot of topics that I think we need to address as we move forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
Eric Bach with the Los Angeles Unified School District. This has been a great discussion. I think we're actually really starting to get into the meat and potatoes of, what a future bond program should look like. I really do. I think there's a lot of work that we still have to go forward. I appreciate, Kathleen, your comments about flexibility. School construction isn't black and white. I think funding a school based on a set criteria, I think, from some perspective makes sense from a minimum standard from a state perspective, but it doesn't really translate into actually being able to fund the school that you need. And I think for so long now, schools have designed their programs based on what the funding can provide you. When there's some, as the examples that were shared today show, that there's some great ways you can design and structure your school sites, and the funding could could make that happen and make that more of a reality throughout the state. So I think that's great. I appreciate that. As far as the facility condition assessments or state data inventory, our district wholeheartedly agrees with that. We're in the middle of that. And I just wanted to come and offer any information that we've put together to the state and to OPSC as well. We're in the middle of doing that ourselves, both from an energy standpoint as well as a condition assessment standpoint, and we've just completed all of our high schools.
So are you using a program you created? Did you buy a CAN program? What did you do?
It's something internal. We've developed ourselves. I think there's some outside collaboration and stuff. We'd be happy to share that information.
You want to give it to us for free?
We can talk, sir. We can talk.
Yeah, well, maybe Bill and Lisa
We give you so much the last 10 years. We should give this back to software. It's probably used our dollars to build the thing.
Is it the front end cost?
Yeah.
Okay.
It'd be great for
yeah, and
to be able to take a look at that.
We'd love that. You guys come down and see what we've done, how we've put it together, what we're looking at. I think Assemblyman Hagman made a reference that we want to make it usable for schools and get them to participate in it. And I think from our standpoint, this is important for us to know what our needs are going forward. I think a lot of our conversation lately has always been about, the PIW and what we've done, but it doesn't tell you anything about what we need going forward.
Right.
It's kind of a wasted conversation in our opinion. I think what we need to do is figure out generally where school districts up and down the state, what their priorities are,
right,
what their focus is going to be, and then how do we go about achieving that and helping them through some sort of assistance. But absent that conversation, we're really not going to get very far.
Right.
But we'd be happy to help try to move that conversation forward. Any information we have, we'd be happy to share. So I just want to share that.
Any other comments?
Good morning. My name is John Nichols. I'm a principal and practice leader with HMC Architects. We do a lot of work with school districts all over the state. Applaud the conversation that's going on around here, and it's a good discussion. One of the things that I wanted to comment on in sort of applauding your talk this morning about educational flexibility and the need that school districts should be provided to be provided time to look at that. And the funding concept, I think one of the things that I wanted to say, Ms. Buchanan, with regard to districts getting in line for funding, one of the things that I've seen working over the past few decades is that whenever there's a carrot for a district to get in line for state funding that is triggered by DSA plan approval in recent case, it motivates, incentivizes shortcuts to be taken. So these creative engagements of educators and community members to think of different ways of delivering instruction is inhibited by the rush to get in line for funding, get your approval from DSA, and get in line for funding. So it's an interesting discussion to want to provide that extra flexibility, but when you place that carrot out there that motivates districts to rush to get into the state institutes, they're motivated not to take that time to engage their academic folks and the community to explore the different types of instructional delivery.
But we're talking about once you've been through all of that and you have all your approvals, then you come to us for funding and you're on the list. The question is how long do you stay on the list?
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. It's before you get to that point, to get on the list, you have to get through DSA right now. And in order to get through DSA, we have to expedite what we do as architects to get in line for that.
Right.
And I'm seeing shortcuts being taken by districts that want to plan, want to engage broader constituencies in what their learning spaces should look like, but they don't because they need to get in line. So I know that we want to create jobs, but I know in this era, energy efficiency, operational efficiency is critical, as well as getting the maximum return on investment for academic outcomes. And it's taking more time with our users to come to that consensus within the community to decide what really a facility should look like to deliver education to their kids. And the rush to get in line to DSA inhibits that. in some way or in a great way.
Mr. Nichols, do you have a suggestion about what, I mean, I guess what I hear too is how we fund, say, charter schools or some of the other programs where we provide the reservation up front and then they have a period of time to perfect it, that we don't do in new construction or modernization. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, anything, Kathleen, that could be done to give a district a defined period of time that they could start a process and they knew when they needed to complete it would allow them and us to create a roadmap to get the steps completed. But any time where faster is better, no matter how much you intend to want to plan, if that carrot's out there, the quicker you get in, especially when funds start to diminish, that you're going to be more likely to get the state funding, you're going to take shortcuts. So anything that would define a planning and execution period that was defined and a district could count on, the team could develop the roadmap to go through the right steps. So that would be what I would encourage.
Yeah, I probably look a little perplexed because for most districts, it's a district choice in terms of what process they want to use, and in terms of the architect you hire and your ability to have your site master plan committees that involve parents and teachers, it can be a very efficient process where you get that input, or it can be an architect that says, well, let's meet back again in 2 months, in which case, it's not really the process that's holding it up. It's the fact the architect might be a little bit overcommitted and can't meet frequently enough. Because I've seen tremendous input go into projects that are designed and get DSA approval in a very short period of time, and I've seen other projects that get dragged out. So to a large extent, it's the district is making a decision there that's outside of our hands, and I can understand where they want to get it to DSA quickly if you are where you are in the program right now and you're running out of funds. But still, the district has got to work. But we can't avoid the fact that we might, run out of funds with a bond in the future. But the district itself has to determine what process it wants to use with all of its stakeholders.
One of the things that's symbolic to me that I've heard districts talk about in the last couple of years, a year or two, is that they've made statements like, well, now that our assessed valuation is depressed and we can't issue bonds, and now that the state's out of money, we might as well do planning. We might as well think ahead.
So the architect says it's good now.
There are some districts that have been planning all along.
That is true. But there are a lot of districts that the only reason they're choosing to do good planning is because they really have limited funding to do anything else. I'm just concerned that when, local bonds and assessed valuations start to go up and they're able to, and when the state does have whatever funding they do, that will return to...
That's a local decision, though. Yeah. They should have been planning all along. They should plan again. And I don't know how we force a district to do better planning.
Just give them a defined period to allow it to happen.
Just a quick question for everybody here, too, or just something to think about. We have fire sprinklers, we have alarms. How about IT? You have it on your list. I mean, we have to have computers for these kids starting next year. Is that something we're going to allow to put in that, what little money we got left? A, and B, how does that go forward? For not the tablets and computers the students use, but the actual infrastructure, the wireless, the T100 lines, whatever the case may be, to get that to the school site.
Well, I think the current bond, but I guess the question is there any way of assessing what our IT needs are? In the old, and even the regulations, maybe this isn't your domain, maybe we should be taught, but, we used to require, 6 drops? I mean, now you use wireless, so I don't know, even in terms of what we require, if we should be doing.
The flexibility as technology
I think there's been some surveys with the Smarter Balanced Assessment component and readiness for that, and I'll check in to see if that's available to provide to the board.
We had a presentation in my committee. I think they are still, over half the districts haven't responded, and it's not even clear exactly with information they have, exactly what they're counting. But hopefully we will have more info on that. But that survey was primarily counting computers, and I don't remember to what extent they were taking a look at the bandwidth. I mean, what happens when half your students run a computer at the same time. Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you.
All righty. Look forward to more discussions. Thank you very much.
August.